Hey everybody, what's going on? It is Cinco de Mayo 2019, and Left is Law is back. I'm really excited. I have the time and the availability to start doing stuff like this again, and it certainly hasn't gotten less important than when I first started up the show. So we're still really small scale, obviously. I'm recording this out of my kitchen, but I'm excited to be back, and I think we're going to do a lot of new things that we weren't doing before that will be really valuable. So, what I want to get into today is first of all, say go Trailblazers. And then I want to talk about Steven Crowder. He's going to be a person, him and Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about. There's a couple of reasons that I want to talk about these people. The first is that the left is fundamentally lacking in rebuttals to conservative talking heads. There are a lot of well spoken dudes out there that are pushing these points. They're very calm, and the right really looks up to them. They're radicalizing a lot of people, and the internet has obviously become this really key place for persuasion that's just completely left behind. So I'm going to start by going through one of his most recent videos, just one that I heard just the other day. I'm eventually going to go through a lot more of his videos, a lot of his Change My Mind series and stuff, but I'm going to link below the video that I'm talking about. Specifically, this video is called The Top 4 Lessons from Venezuela's Socialism. And I will lay out his arguments since I'm not cool enough to know how to put the video in. And I will just put where the video or where the argument is in the video in the comments below. So I'm just going to go straight from the beginning of the video. Like I said, it's linked below, so you can find it there, and let's get into it. So right from the top of the video, Steven Crowder's cracking a bunch of these jokes. He doesn't know how to say Guaido, and nor does a single person in his 10-person staff. This seems fairly minor. It's a petty thing to focus on, but to me it demonstrates that they haven't researched any of the things that they're talking about beyond the level of making their point. Actually, Steven Crowder spends very little time talking about Venezuela itself and spends a lot more time just talking about how socialism is bad. A lot of people, and a lot of these conservative talking heads in particular, don't know as much about international politics and just try to use little bits of international politics to make their domestic points. I want to do 3 quick bottom lines before I even touch any more of his specific argumentation. The first is that Crowder should know better than to be a media puppet. He's a smart guy. You look at MSNBC, Fox News, and there's actually no difference in the media coverage on certain things, and Venezuela happens to be one of them, where really you're going to get the exact same story on the left as you're getting on the right. There is no world outside of the narrative that is presented to you by the media, and so to be outside of or supporting, you know, I don't want to say the Maduro regime because we're not supporting the Maduro regime either, but to be against Juan Guaido, against a coup, is somehow this radical position that almost no one holds. You should be very skeptical of when both the media and the Congress have a bipartisan position on something, and this is one of those things. The second point is exactly what I just said. Nicolas Maduro is not a good dude, but neither is Juan Guaido. When Juan Guaido was called the interim president by the United States, 81% of the country had no idea who he was. His name was never on a ballot. He was educated in America, and the bottom line that I think you should know about him is that he is proposing a constitution that privatizes the oil industry. Just keep that in mind as we go forward, and I'll come back to it. There's something that people in Venezuela have been chanting often, and that is ni con uno ni con otro, which means neither one nor the other. And I think that that's the guiding principle for a lot of how we should be approaching this, that neither the coup being led by Juan Guaido or the current Nicolas Maduro administration is very good for Venezuela. But that's the case in a lot of places, right? Like Barack Obama once said, if this is really about human rights, he was talking about Syria, why wouldn't I just bomb the Congo? Understand that people talk about things like human rights and starvation selectively only to make a point, and not because they actually care about the human rights or the starvation occurring in those countries, because that's happening in all sorts of places, but they don't talk about it at all. The last bottom line point that I want to make is A lot of these actors have been around for a long time. I'm talking about people like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and particularly Elliot Abrams, who is the special convoy to Venezuela. These guys have been stirring the pot in South America, and essentially, honestly, most of them are war criminals. A lot of these same people have been perpetuating war crimes in South America for years and years. Um, Blackwater, I understand, I think they're under a different name now, but Blackwater was just found out as trying to sell us 5,000 mercenaries in Venezuela to help lead Guaido's uprising against Maduro. So it's pretty clear here that the thing you need to understand are there are two main interests of the United States, and neither of them are human rights or starvation. Uh, One is the military industrial complex and making sure that they make some money, and the second is the oil industry, and we'll get into that. So the first thing that he talks about is that they've been running over people with tanks. So there is one video that surfaced last week of one member of the military going rogue, and he essentially uses his truck to either push people out of the way, or you could argue run people over. I don't think anybody actually gets ran over, but certainly had people not moved, that would have been a consequence of what he did. That's bad, but here's what Crowder's not talking about. The first thing is that that's one member of a big military in Maduro's regime who doesn't seem to have been instructed to do that. And in fact, you can see the other military member trying to stop him from doing it. More importantly, though, is that we're only getting one side of this narrative. So when military forces used tear gas to disperse Guaido's coup attempt on the day that he announced it, the militia that Guaido has raised returned literal live fire at people firing tear gas, but he doesn't talk about that. That's linked below. There's footage of Guaido getting kicked out of the barrios, that's like the inner cities of Venezuela, and this is just in the last couple weeks as well. I'll link that YouTube video below too. But Crowder and a lot of the media are painting a Venezuela that is chock full of fed up people, when in reality, Maduro maintains support near the levels of Donald Trump. Sure, that's not particularly high, but it's high enough that there isn't really one side of the story here. It's not even like it's 40-60 either. Like I said, there's a lot of people who don't really want one or the other right now. And that shouldn't be surprising to you in light of U.S. military history in South America. Again, you can look all this stuff up, but this is almost general information for most of us now. We literally paid groups that were death squads in the 70s and 80s, that's the Ronald Reagan administration and others, to kill people in South America and to promote democracy. So make no mistake that the people of South America are very skeptical of our neoliberal history there. And one other thing I kind of want to think on here, at least, is that we have this idea that Maduro is this like grand dictator, and to some extent, there's no doubt he is. But if he was as bad as everybody says he was, how has Juan Guaido been out of prison this long? How is Juan Guaido not dead? You don't lead a military coup against a country and somehow stay out of prison in a world of a dictator. And you can't stage months-long protests in the world of a dictator. We have one side of the story where we have huge protests that are just massive and overwhelming, and then this other side of the story that's like, oh, we're crushing all the dissent. It really can't be one or the other, and the reality is that you have small protests that aren't even probably big enough to warrant someone being arrested. But even if they did arrest him, that would just be an excuse for, that would just be an excuse for America and other countries to elevate their level of involvement. So as Nicolas Maduro, you have a really tricky choice where someone's trying to lead a military coup against you, but if you arrest them, then the United States will probably engage in a military invasion of your country. So where's the winning? Next. He just says socialism doesn't work. This is the real reason that he's doing this video. And Crowder doesn't even really make an argument here. He just wants to make socialists take responsibility for Venezuela. I think there's a lot of problems with this argument, but I'm just going to hone in on one because I'm going to do a much longer video on Crowder's attacks on socialism in general and just capitalism versus socialism. So the only thing that I'll talk about here is that it's not completely Venezuela's fault that they're broke. OPEC and Saudi Arabia essentially started overproducing oil years ago, which made the price of oil go down vastly. And then on top of that, the United States placed sanctions on them, making it impossible for them to get a loan, which would be the traditional method of probably getting through something like a downturn in the economy. And certainly, Venezuela is a single export commodity economy. That's part of it too, but that's a lot of countries, capitalist or not. And so, uh, sure, there can be multi causalities for why Venezuela's economy is struggling, but there was just a report released a couple days ago, I want to say, that said 40,000 people in Venezuela have starved as a direct result of U.S. sanctions. So to say that it's just Venezuela's fault is just not paying attention to the way that the world economy and world sanctions have moved around them to intentionally make their economy struggle and suffer. Um, Next, he says that Maduro was elected in a fair and free election. And here, Crowder has completely departed from his allies on the right, and I don't even think he did that on purpose. He's doing this to make the aforementioned point about socialism and that, oh, look, he was fairly elected. This is what socialism looks like. But he fails to discuss in any part accusations about undue influence of the election, which is the impression of most people, in particular the right. I guess I'm not going to wade into the fairness of that election if Stephen Crowder's not going to, but I will just say this, and it helps make my earlier point too. Imagine if Hillary Clinton had led a coup against Donald Trump and refused to concede the election, took 40 people and marched them up to the Capitol and were firing guns at police trying to disperse them. And imagine that the way that that would be treated, and if people were to say Hillary Clinton was the legitimate president, and heck, at least she was on a ballot. She got more votes than Donald Trump. There's a stronger argument there than there is for Juan Guaido, and just imagine the way that that would look in our country, right? So that gives you a pretty good idea of where Crowder's stance is. I think the next thing that he says is probably the most important thing that he says at all. He says that Venezuela is the most oil-rich country in the world, and ding, 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 like, that's it. You hit the nail on the head, but not for the reasons that you think you did. He's trying to use this to say, well, they should be just fine. They should be wealthy. There's no reason that they're poor. But that doesn't engage in literally any economic analysis about the state of oil right now and about sanctions. But on top of that, demonstrates precisely why the United States cares so much and why Crowder is ultimately getting puppeted into the game here, because the goal is to get that oil. Again, the number one tenet of Juan Guaido's constitution is to privatize the oil industry. So this really makes it pretty clear for you. This is a good package for Elliot Abrams and friends to go after. You're not only getting the oil, but you're also getting to destroy a socialist economy and then say, look at how bad socialism fails. Like, this is everything that a neoconservative could want in an invasion of a country. And this is almost exactly why you get us messing with South America for 30, 40 years. And this is also another reason that Steven Crowder should be very adamantly against what's happening. Because people who support Donald Trump, one of the reasons that they really liked him was the fact that he didn't want to be involved in the Middle East and he didn't want to be involved in South America. But now his advisors are tricking him into it, and the Trump people want to just follow along. Like, they're just abandoning the reasons that they liked him in the first place. Like, he's not draining the swamp. That was like one of the only good things he could have done, at least from my perspective, from my view of his platform. And he's not even doing that. Like, when he said he was going to withdraw from Syria, that was probably a good thing, and he gets talked out of it, right? So, you should have a different opinion on this. Lastly, he uses this to make a gun argument. Again, not talking about Venezuela because of any interest in Venezuela, but rather using it as a tool to discuss domestic policy. So he's basically making this argument that if there were more arms, we would have a full-blown civil war. I'm also going to do a video on guns, and I'm going to do a series, like I said, responding to the change my mind arguments. But Crowder is assuming a consensus amongst the populace that doesn't exist. Like I said, it's not like it's 60% Maduro, 40% Guaido, and even if it was, that would be a pretty disastrous situation to have guns in. But instead, the populace is much more split about what they think. This means that the guns likely wouldn't be used in one way. They would be used amongst warring factions and contribute to more death. And he goes on to say, give them 300 million guns and see what happens. Like, I promise you, however you think that would go, it would not go well. I don't know if Crowder recently got a contract with the military-industrial complex, or he's got a sponsor in the Mug Club and has been struggling to find people after demonetization, but exporting guns does not traditionally go very well. There's this country called Syria that you might have heard of, and things were kind of a disaster there in turns out that giving guns to people who want to overthrow governments usually isn't going so well, and then maybe those people don't actually think what they think we think. Maybe those people are actually ISIS. Like, he goes on to say that all socialist and communist regimes do this or eventually resort to this after taking people's guns. I'm going to do a whole video on it, like I said. For now, I'm going to leave you with a Snopes fact check below about how gun control and gun confiscation aren't the same thing, and about how people conflate the two when they talk about the Soviet Union. And then lastly, the last argument that I'm going to hit on here is that democratic socialism always ends this way. Is essentially the argument he's going for. And maybe it's not Bernie Sanders, but someone down the line would eventually act like this. This is a slippery slope argument, and it's the same crap argument that people are always using to beat back socialism. Well, if people are dependent on the government, then we'll be doomed. He goes on to make the argument, if Bezos and Bill Gates are bad guys, then our economy does poorly for a little while. But if socialist leaders are bad guys, then people get run over by tanks. The biggest problem with this argument is that it comes from the assumption that our system is working in the first place. Literally 1 in 5 children in the United States live below the poverty line. More than 30,000 people die each year in this country from lack of health care. This is in spite of having massively more resources than anybody in the world. Like, that's one thing that doesn't get taken into account often when you talk about some of the countries that have failed, and the fact that they didn't have the massive resources that the United States have, the massive means of production, the fluctuation of economy that we have, and that's probably relevant. The B point there is not only does our system have more resources, but we also have more checks and balances. And while our checks and balances aren't perfect, like, that's pretty clear if you look to the fact that, I don't know, a president could obstruct justice 10 times hypothetically, and then hypothetically fire an attorney general who won't protect him, and hire a new one who thinks obstruction of justice doesn't exist and hide behind that. In general, our system of checks and balances works pretty well, and the fact that we have constant elections cycling people out means that if the pendulum swings too far one way, that often it swings back. We saw the start of that in the 2018 midterms. Expect to see that finish in 2020. And then the last point I want to make on this is that this is really just alarmist rhetoric that hurts the lower and the middle class, the people who are most in need of help. Things like Medicare for all and free college are complex and difficult waters to navigate, but the alternative is not working. And the idea that giving an inch to socialism somehow leads to Venezuela is just the type of crap that Fox News and MSNBC both push to keep profits up and people down. Right now, people cannot afford their health care. Even if you have employer coverage, people can't afford their deductibles, so many people just opt to go uninsured. Other people can't afford to make their student loan payments. There is no excuse for this. The biggest mistake that the left is making is allowing people to continually frame this as some kind of damaging tax to the middle class. Like, if we raise taxes or somebody has to pay for it, that it's going to be the middle class. This, in spite of the fact, and I'll do a whole thing on the tax structure too, but this in spite of the fact that people who make the most money in this country also often pay the lowest percentage of their taxes. How is it that Mitt Romney pays 17% of his total income, and the rest of us are stuck paying 30-something, and somehow are convinced that we're the ones who are going to get screwed by the leftists? Like, as if the conservatives and the status quo aren't already screwing us. A system which allows the people who make more money to pay less taxes, a literal regressive tax system, is already in place, and somehow we continually think that the middle class is the ones who are going to be hurt by the taxes. Now, I can't speak for every candidate who's running for office, but I can tell you that we could very easily adjust the tax system to work like it's supposed to, so that people would actually pay their fair percentage of taxes and lower taxes on the middle and lower class. So to think that somehow, all of these policies are going to lead to the end of the world and higher taxes and everybody starving is just the type of thing that the mainstream media and people who are all in bed together to make a bunch of money exactly want you to think, so that we never have real change that stops vulnerable people, and particularly the middle class, from being gutted over and over again. That's all for today. Cheer for the Trailblazers, and I will catch you all next time. Peace.